extractives, we have issues of infrastructure, we have issues of urbanization, we have globalized trade, food production. All these issues also impact on biodiversity loss. And I think that we have to consider all these issues and not just climate change as the only threat to biodiversity. The other thing I think we need to consider is the post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Negotiations are ongoing. They've started. The open-ended working group has been meeting. And the first draft of this document has 21 targets. And one of the targets, target 3, refers to at least 30% of global land and sea areas are conserved. And the details of what does this mean and where will this 30% come from, these are some of the things that the negotiators and in the open-ended group are beginning to engage with and to offer their perspectives. The framework that you're going to hear today, the shared earth, the shared oceans framing, is part of the contribution to this particular discourse. And so we're hoping that in today's presentation and engagement with yourselves, we'll also hear from you what your perspectives are and how we might be able to evolve this particular framing. We are here at the Ocean and Islands Pavilion. So of course, it is important for us to also think about the oceans and to think about why these oceans are important. We know that the oceans provide a significant amount of protein that is in the food that we eat. We know that 50% of the oxygen on Earth comes from these oceans, and that they are important in regulating climate change. But we also know that these oceans are in trouble. We know about the fisheries crisis because of overfishing. We know of pollution of the oceans. We know about microplastics that are being found in the ocean and being consumed by the fish. We know the damage that climate change and global warming is doing to the coral reefs and causing bleaching. We know about sea level rise. And of course, we know the issue of extractives and seabed mining for oil and gas. And this story is not very dissimilar from the terrestrial ecosystems. They too are under similar pressures. So this event is really continuing the discussions that we have been having within Africa with some civil society organizations, and beginning to think about what are the challenges that we face for both terrestrial and ocean areas. And from our perspective, we wanted to begin to take control of the conservation agenda in Africa, and also to shape the solutions to these challenges that we are facing, both the oceans and the terrestrial ecosystems. And through these engagements within Africa, we articulated a framework that we're calling the Shared Earth and the Shared Oceans, and this was published in Science in August of 2021. So this side event is going to provide a presentation of this framework, and that we're hoping that what we are presenting is not the final word on this particular issue, but it's a perspective. And so we're hoping that we can engage with yourselves. And we're not looking at reinforcement of what we are presenting, but also we want to hear if there are divergent views about that. We would like to welcome those views, and that we hope that we can then shape the evolution of this framework that we are presenting today. So we have 3 panelists with us today, and the first speaker is David Obura. And David is with Cordio, which is an organization based in Mombasa. And they do a lot of work around marine and coastal areas. So David will be presenting the Shared Earth and the Shared Ocean model. And after David has presented, we're going to ask Maxi Lewis. Maxi Lewis is from Namibia. She's with an organization called NACSO. Sometimes I say NASCO. She always corrects me. And Maxi works a lot with CBNRM, community-based natural resources management. She works with communities. And so she will be looking at how does this kind of framing that David is presenting actually play out in reality in terms of on the ground? And how might this framework actually be applied at that particular level? And then finally, we're going to hear from Masha Kalinina, and Masha is with the Pew Charitable Trust, and she's sort of a global international policy expert. And so she's going to share with us her perspectives, her views on this whole issue of the 30% target, some of the discussions that are taking place within the GBF. So that's the agenda. So without wasting any more time, I'm going to call on David to share with us the model. So David, over to you. I think you want? Yeah.
Thank you, Yemi. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for attending this session. We're on the last sprint here before everything finishes after 4 long days. So this paper, I'll present the technical side of this paper. I know some of you here, and you know me, I'm a scientist and dealing with some of these issues. But I want to emphasize that we have an authorship with 16 authors on this paper, including Maxi, Yemi, others from the Africa CSO Biodiversity Alliance, many of whom represent the community context that Maxi will present to us as well. And this paper really presents our framing from an African perspective on meeting the area target in particular, but it could apply to any of the targets of the Global Biodiversity Framework. We wanted to approach the targets as a whole to reduce threats. You know, at the community level, it's not a matter of meeting just one target or another target. People have to meet all targets, really, to live sustainably. And in the case of the Global Biodiversity Framework, this means the 3 objectives of the CBD, under which the 4 goals of the framework are developed for 30 years, and then the 21 targets as they are right now. I'll just note the URL. You can access, there's a free link to the paper there, which Science gave us, which we can put this up later on if you'd like to access that. Now, the starting point is that, of course, the global condition of nature varies from intact places to completely transformed places. And this is from the IPBES global assessment that I was part of, so I had access to this information easily. On land and on sea, we've made these estimates. The point is not to be specific about the particular amounts, but what we wanted to emphasize is that the way biodiversity conservation is planned goes for biodiversity hotspots, goes for the places important for species, for ecosystems, and to sustain that biodiversity. And so effort tends to be focused on the left-hand side of these x-axes in the most intact places. And that's for very good reasons. And then as you go into these anthromes or intensive agriculture and cities on the right, you don't have national parks just for biodiversity conservation. It might be for other purposes. But most of the people that we deal with in our work live in this intermediate space, between the intact and the most transformed. And we really wanted to really put some meat into the discussion about nature-based solutions. How can you have nature-based solutions if you don't have nature intact, or you don't have nature-based actions to build up those solutions? So we want to focus in these shared spaces. So framing that a little bit again, so this shows the situation on land, and we've emphasized this because, of course, a lot of the interest in Africa is terrestrially based. So much of the 17% of protected area on land meeting HE Target 11 is in this most intact areas. Not all of it, of course. Some of it spreads further out, but this is a schematic. And the question is, moving towards Target 3 of the Global Biodiversity Framework, extending to 30% protection. If we follow the same model or logic, that would be added in the most intact places over there on the right. But there are issues about effectiveness of management in existing protected areas. There's issues of equity and application of protected areas and conservation for indigenous people and local communities. But there's also this issue of high dependence of people living in these spaces on nature, and how can we get conservation happening where it matters to them, so it supports their livelihoods. So this framework is really focused on trying to spread the effort, spread the action across all of those places, because in Africa there's very high dependence on nature services, rain-fed agriculture and so on, disaster protection across all of these landscapes and then in seascapes as well. So how can we take that grey of the new effort and spread it further out over there? So this framework is based, including in cities as well, but we won't go into that so much, but that's of course a topic that others are discussing. There are 4 basic pillars to this framework. The first is to focus at the local scale. So instead of doing global analyses that identify the priority hotspots of biodiversity and then you go and work in those places, in a country, can you take the global biodiversity framework targets to a local government setting, a county, a state, whatever it might be, and get them to try and meet those targets locally, okay? And then you add up the national from that, from those local areas. This is important because at the local area you can focus on equity and people. The stakeholders are present, they can have a voice, they can go to meetings because they're not in the capital or not in an international setting somewhere. And the other most important thing that's particularly important for IPLC is that you can apply local knowledge and traditional knowledge at this local scale as well. Of course, we need to use scientific information as well. We need to use a science that tells us, what proportion of a habitat needs to be protected for conservation, or what amount of offtake is sustainable for fisheries or for medicinal plants or something else, or for timber. But I think we have the capacity to bring the science down to local levels much more than we've ever had before. And I think that's a much easier challenge than trying to take local knowledge up to the global scale in terms of, because it's how do you aggregate the diversity of information there is. And then the 4th pillar is that you address all relevant targets at that scale, and you try and do that. Now, there's one result that's come out in the literature earlier this year that gives the particular meat to this, is that the study by Garibaldi et al. Found that if you maintain 20% intact native habitat down to local scales, you can both meet biodiversity conservation goals and you can generate ecosystem services or nature's contributions to people. And if you do it at local levels, they can access those services. If you have, large protected areas, or you just have it in large bits of land or bits of sea, there are people who live very far away from that who can't access the services that are generated locally. So soil regeneration, pollination, things like that. So if you can get this 20% down to the, square kilometer scale, you can generate benefits for people, and then you need to aggregate up from that. And through doing this, you can address sustainable use, inclusion, and conservation together. Now, of course, it's not a simple equation. It will not be easy to implement this, but we feel that in an African context, this is the way to really generate success in the future, certainly much more than the success we've been having so far. So the message here is that rather than focusing on just one target, and area targets are important because we can measure them very easily, you can get them from satellite information, and they're very measurable. But through this approach, you can look locally and start to look at all the other targets you would address in the process of generating that 30%. So how much restoration do you need to go from 5% in good condition to 20% in good condition? What spatial planning do you need? How do you deal with mainstreaming biodiversity to do this? What benefits to people can you provide? So it really provides you a way to address all the targets together. I'll just finish up showing a couple of different options for this. So this is the basic model that I've just presented. Now, thinking some of the other targets. So target 21 is on equitable and effective participation. So this is really around governance models, isn't it? And of course, we want to, there's a huge push in the Congress now in the IUCN, the conservation movement over the last decade to really prioritize the interests of people on the ground. So local communities, indigenous peoples, those who have rights and governance rights to spaces. And this approach helps you do it from the bottom up because the negotiations to meet these targets need to happen locally with the stakeholders and the rights holders in the room. And so you can meet these targets through a mix of wilderness areas or IPLC or other effective conservation measures, protected areas. It can vary across that whole space depending on the condition of nature. A second scenario is looking at restoration and regeneration. Of course, as you go to the right along that axis, more of the area that you would put under protection will need some level of restoration to raise the state of the habitats and the species so they qualify for conservation targets. So perhaps when you start planning restoration all the way out on the right, you can have an area that would count towards the targets, but you don't have the integrity of the ecosystem at a high enough level to fully count towards a target. But you can have a target of getting there in 20 years' time, and you can deal with those time lags that it takes to do effective restoration at those scales. So this is just an illustration of how you could try and use this approach to really address the details of conservation and meeting people's needs at local scales. So just bringing it back to oceans and coasts, because we're in the Oceans Pavilion, and I'm a coral biologist, so I always want to try and bring in the ocean somehow. Of course, this can be applied, particularly in the coastal zone. I think it's very powerful. The coastal zone is really where so many things come together, and you need both terrestrial and marine actions to happen together. And this is a way to help knit those landscape and seascape actions. We're focused a lot on locally managed marine areas, which are our version of other effective conservation measures under development in coastal areas and controlled explicitly by communities. And it's really building up this sort of rights and agency approach that when you deal with local government, you really deal with leadership locally that can deliver on these actions in the way that people want, that are culturally appropriate as well. And then, of course, marine spatial planning is a huge move that we're all promoting. And just like Target 1 under the framework is basically equivalent to marine spatial planning. So those things line up quite nicely. So this is our initial attempt to present this. We'll put up the links later on so you can get to the paper quite easily. But I think with that, I'll hand back to Yemi, finish the technical presentation. So thank you.
Thanks, David. There's lots of information, and I'm sure there'll be lots of questions for that. But that's great. That's why we're here. Now, I'm going to call on Maxi. So Maxi, based on what David is saying, we have clearly what is emerging here is that the idea is not to separate people from nature, but to bring nature and people together. But also that we need to look at how do we build up from the bottom up. And as we've been going around and listening to various presentations at the Congress, one has this sense that there's increasing resistance from top-down solutions. So perhaps you can share with us from the Namibia experience, how people and nature are coming together and how you're building up from the bottom and the contribution to conservation and livelihoods issues. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Yemi. Yeah, thank you so much, Yemi, and thank you, David, for giving that background. I think it gives me an opportunity just to delve into my topic, which is looking at what David was just presenting, and that is the localized level, interventions from the communities as part of the 3030. So I think when I look at the experiences that we have in sub-Saharan Africa, not also so much in Namibia, because there's a lot of similarities in these countries in the way that we have over the years have implemented this program. So David was referring to the CBNRM program, which is the Community-Based Natural Resource Program, which is a localized program. And the first thing is that this program created an enabling environment. So we have at least an enabling environment in terms of policies in place that regulates these communities to be able to be involved in some form of conservation. And this is very strong in Southern Africa. I'm sure it's also very strong in other parts of Africa, but I think we have seen a lot of the implementation being very successful in Southern Africa and part of East Africa, especially on the terrestrial levels. So we have, for me, we have already some low-hanging fruit because this program, from the Namibian context where I come from, has addressed a couple of issues. One is that it has created some governance structures already in terms of conservation issues that you can use with these communities to address a lot of the targets that David just actually presented there. The other one is that we have very good plans and management plans that can be managed by these localized structures. And I think the third one is the issue of livelihoods, which is really important because for us, one of the lessons that we have learned over the years is that communities and local communities or indigenous communities need to have rights to be able to manage their resources. If they don't have those rights, why should they manage? I normally make comparisons with people in urban areas. It's like, when we look at communities, we look at them as if there's a totally social structure. They are a social structure like anybody in urban areas. So if they don't have income from or have put any value on any resource, why should they look after those resources? And since a lot of the programs that we are working with, it's on wildlife management or forest management or any other products, they want to see the value. So if there's value for them to manage this, then they will be able to also being involved in projects like this. So to answer your question, Yemi, in terms of the first time when I heard about the 30%, I think I heard about 50% first. That was my understanding. And in my mind, working with local communities, I look at a mixed land use, and I say to myself, Namibia, give an example, is a desert type of country. And we have been doing conservation for over years. So the first thing in my mind is that who decided that there will be 50%? That was my first question. And then the second one, it was also the issue of did we consult? Did we go to the localized level and said, you know what, do you agree that we want to do this together? It's going to be 50% or 30%. Because for us, when I look at my country, we already can contribute to the 30%. But it means that 30%, theoretically, when I look at it, is good. We like it. We do conservation. There's already low-hanging fruits that we can use for that. But the question I need to ask is that because it was a top-down approach, what is the criteria for this? So when I work with conservancies is a mixed landscapes. We also have communities that contribute a lot, for instance, towards parks. They have these buffer zones. And the first thing that my communities will ask is that, are we going to create more parks for us to be, for us to give more land to government in terms of conservation? Is that what you're looking at? Or are you going to take the type of land that we already have, the contribution that we already make to conservation, and add that, and then that will become the 30%? So I think this is the question that I think everybody is asking. What is the criteria? What is the definition in terms of determining that 30%? I don't think the communities are saying that we don't want it. We want it, but can it be in a consultative manner that we actually do it? And I think, so that is the question that I think we need to answer. Secondly, we need to be very much aware also that we don't want to create conservation models that does not, that replace livelihoods. So we need to make sure that there is no impact on those livelihoods. So, and I think for me that is also very key that we need to look at that. Once we replace livelihoods with conservation models, that it showcases the world that we are doing conservation, but it has no meaning on the ground, then we can forget about these models. These models means nothing if they don't produce livelihoods for these communities. So I think from my small contribution, that's what I want to say, that we need to look at the localized levels. There need to be some consultations, and we need to make sure that the communities' livelihoods, for me, as long, whether it's ocean communities, whether it's terrestrial communities, these are communities, we need to look at those livelihoods. Otherwise, we will never, ever address the issue of conservation and the agenda that we have. Thank you so much, Yemi.
Don't sit down.
Oh, sorry.
Wait.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, before you sit down.
Yes.
So can you, from the work that you're doing with these communities, I mean, what is the contribution to conservation?
Okay.
Because here we're talking about this relationship, and I think David was talking about this, the relationship between the goals.
Yes, yeah.
So conservation, sustainable use, and benefits.
Yes.
So how are you seeing that playing out at the local level?
I will put that contribution in two categories. One is intangible, and I think I referred to governance. So for instance, there is governance structures that has been created. So you have somebody in conservation that you can work with. So those governance, and I think that is a really good contribution. You have democratic communities where, so I mean, it's probably not so much linked to conservation, but I work with communities. We have governance structures, but we also have any other social structures being strengthened. We have elections, we have accountability, so you have organizational structures that are very democratic. It's not what you are looking at in the world. You have these communities where there is democratic structures and there is accountability, but very much looking at the social construct of conservation. Then you have a voice. These communities have voices themselves. They can talk on their own behalf. And I think that is what I'm looking at in terms of intangible. But on the tangible side is what we want to address in conservation, is that the issue of contributing land towards conservation. So where I come from, people are involved in conservation, so they open up areas. They sacrifice areas for conservation. Some of them even move to create space for conservation. It's not the 30% what we want to contribute. So I think that is one of the tangible benefits that we are seeing. The other one is reducing poaching. So the more they are involved, the more benefits they get, the more they are in their leadership in terms of management, the more we are reducing issues around illegal wildlife trade, poaching, human-wildlife conflict. So that is some of it that I see is a bigger contribution in terms of conservation. So I think those are part of that is our bigger goal, and these communities are contributing towards that. There could be more, but I think those two for me are the biggest ones.
Fantastic.
Yeah.
So thank you so much. It's very powerful. Appreciate that. So Marcia, you've heard these perspectives. She's a co-author to the paper, and you've heard David's presentation. So it'd be really good to hear your perspective as somebody who has not been part of this thinking and the framing of this particular approach. So perhaps you share with us your perspectives on this 30 by 30 or the 30% target, as well as other issues around the global biodiversity framework. So over to you.
Thank you. And a big thank you to David for inviting me to be on this panel. I had the fortune to be in Kenya, and David made it possible for me to visit the communities that he actually works with on the ground. And so I met fishers, I visited the landing sites, I was part of some of the local meetings of the governing bodies, and it was really useful for someone like me that really works at the highest level of policy making to see work on the ground. So just a huge thank you again for that opportunity. I will always remember it fondly. And it's exciting for me to be a part of the panel because I'm hearing the way that we can actually make 30 by 30 happen on the ground. And you're right, David, it's the large intact areas that do get a lot of the attention, and that is where that 50% I think is coming from. We're talking about the boreal forest in Canada. We're talking about tundra. We're talking about the Amazon. So there are enormous places that do need our protection. Of course, high seas, right? So that is where some of the larger figures I think come from. And I didn't introduce myself too well. I am with the Pew Charitable Trust. I really focus a lot on the Convention on Biological Diversity and the negotiations that are ongoing around the GBF or the Global Biodiversity Framework. So that's kind of where my perspective comes from. A few thoughts I wanted to share, having listened to the experts here, is as the 30 by 30 is being implemented, and we're going to get the target adopted. It's going to happen, I know. Kunming, April, May 2022. There should be some thinking around whether the places that are under consideration, are these all protected area labels that we need to consider, or is this perhaps a managed area that comes in under target 1, right? We really forget about that target, and I'm so glad you brought up the entirety of the framework. So not everything has to squeeze into the 30 by 30. Managing at all is already a really important step, and really the goal here is to effectively manage the entire Earth, right? And also we should probably talk about OECMs, other effective area-based conservation measures. So that is part of Target 3 and 30 by 30, and these are places that do not have biodiversity conservation as a primary objective, but do achieve biodiversity outcomes for these places. So not everything, we're so used to the protected area model and so used to talking about it in that way, but I'm really excited to see well designed and effective OECMs that meet the criteria set out by the CBD parties, but it's I think there are going to be many different models, right, in application, and you know, locally managed, indigenous managed areas, so all of that is part of that solution. I wanted to highlight the high seas here briefly because there are key areas in the African region that have been identified as part of those initial few sites that could help us get toward the 30 by 30 target in the ocean. And without the high seas, and I love the local work, it needs to happen, but without the high seas, we'll never reach that target. It's just if you count if every nation did 30% of their EEZ, it wouldn't get us to 30 by 30. You need the high seas. And so some of those places I wanted to highlight here are Walvis Ridge, so that's in the Namibia sort of region, the Gulf of Guinea, and the Seychelles-Mauritius Plateau. So these are some of the areas that a report funded by Pew and carried out by UC Santa Barbara highlighted 10 sites that could be protected in the high seas toward 30 by 30. And then just a few other things to mention. There's a motion that's under discussion here, Motion 101, that has to do with this exact topic, and that is 30 by 30 being a stepping stone toward what science says is a larger target in the long term, not in the next 10 years, but you know, we're talking like 2050, especially if you consider restoration. So when you bring in restoration, that's when the target gets larger as well. The other thing I do want to talk about highly and fully protecting and conserving some of these places, in that some areas critical for biodiversity will simply have to be no-go areas other than subsistence use. And that means that environmentally damaging activities are not permitted there. And that's what the science tells us is the best proxy to understand whether outcomes in these areas will be delivered. Because restoration recovery takes so long, right? It takes 10 years to see if coral is rebounding. But we already know that when we're not allowing industrial scale fishing, for example, you're gonna get the outcomes that these managed areas have put forward. And the last thing I'll say is just what's happening in the CBD, which is that, you know, we have an intersessional period now where the parties will be exchanging written submissions until January, February, when they will meet in Geneva for the final negotiation round. And then April, May, Kunming, hopefully in person, a meeting like this where we get it all done and get to these targets. But I really appreciate the work that you've done to help us all understand how this work can be implemented at the local scale. Thank you so much.
No, fantastic, and thank you so much for sharing those perspectives, really useful. So, folks, I'm going to open it up. We have some time. We really would appreciate hearing feedback from you on the model, as well as what you've heard from the panelists today. So, it's open, and raise your hand. I'll get the microphone to you, and if you'd like to direct your question to any one of the panelists, you can indicate who you're directing the question to. So.
Thank you very much for your presentation. My name is Annie. I work for Blue Ventures, a marine conservation organization. And I was wondering, what do you think of tenure rights as a way to be included in 30 by 30? And maybe a question directly to Pew. What do you think that the 30 by 30 framework, do you fear that it could have a negative impact on local communities and indigenous people? And if so, how do you think we could prevent this? Thanks.
I'll take another one before you ask the response. No? Okay. Well, why don't you go ahead?
Okay, thanks, Annie, for that question. So, yeah, so this graph here if I go back to it, is intended to make the point that, yes, you could accommodate different tenure systems. And the whole point of this is to ensure that the local planning that is done is based on local tenure systems to empower those, and if there isn't sort of the legal context for them, to really point that out so that those sorts of things can be accelerated. So we hope that this can really support that and accommodate that.
And did you want to add, Maxi? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I think that's one issue that I think was omitted as part of our. But the other one is also the issue of human rights, which I wanted to add. But I think David has already explained that it is.
To your second question, there's a robust discussion around that in the negotiations. There is a target 21, that's intended to address the importance of recognizing IPLC rights in the entirety of the framework. This isn't just a question for 30 by 30. And the way I think that it's drafted is really useful. Some have suggested specific text to be added to Target 3 itself, and that's also under discussion. Their text has been added to Motion 101 to get specifically at what you're asking. And I think those are incredibly useful conversations, and it's sort of already being resolved, if you will. I can also say that the High Ambition Coalition, which there are now almost half the world's countries support 30 by 30. For the ocean, I can say that. For land, it's about 70 countries. And these coalitions are in direct discussions with indigenous groups that are represented to the CBD to ensure that the language that lands in the framework is comfortable for everybody. And so that's been over a year plus that these dialogues have taken place.
Yes, if I can add to that, as Masha pointed out, so that issue of tenure is under one of the targets already, and certainly listening to the discussions that we've had in Africa, and then also the discussions amongst the parties and observers, is when you treat the targets individually, each target gets loaded more and more and more with the need to address rights and the need to do this and that and the other, which is right. But it is in the framework already, and if you can have a much more integrated target approach, so when you're looking at the planning, you're not just thinking about one target and implementing it, but you're looking in a local area with all the stakeholders. There's how does addressing target 3 agree with target 21? And so you get the complementarity and the synergies across the targets are much stronger if you can address it locally in a local context. And that may simplify delivery of the framework as well.
Thanks, David. Any other, and we can take comments as well. It doesn't have to be a question. So if there's someone that has a comment, please.
Thank you. That was very, very interesting presentations from all of you. I have a question for Maxi, but David, you might also elaborate upon it. Maxi, you mentioned that Southern Africa is one of the very few regions in the whole world where biodiversity is actually increasing. There's increasing habitat for biodiversity, and if you look at elephant numbers, they're escalating, rhinos, etc. That's partly achieved because many select countries have already put, Yemi, I'm sure you know the figures, sort of in the region of 25 to 30% of land under strictly protected state-managed areas. But a lot of additional land is being conserved by communities, and you were discussing that a lot. You were talking about the benefits, therefore they have incentives to preserve. But how is that actually achieved? And you're talking about rights here as well, but what government policies have been put in place to incentivize people that differ in Southern Africa than maybe in other parts of the world that have provided those incentives?
Yeah, thank you so much, Les. I think I can refer and give a case study in terms of what happens in 3 countries that I've been very associated with in terms of CBI, and that's Zimbabwe, Zambia, Namibia, and Botswana. And so there has been a legal framework, and that legal framework in most cases is giving rights to communities in terms of doing, and because most of it started with wildlife management, and then it expanded, and with other policies or legal frameworks that support this actual act. We have an act in most of these countries. So with us, it has to do with tourism, both consumptive and non-consumptive tourism. So it will be ecotourism projects, making sure that communities are involved as part of that. Then we have hunting that is being included as part of that. There's issues around legally trading also within this framework. So that is the act that is giving them. So I just want to emphasize that wildlife is still owned by the state. So this is conditional rights that communities are being given. So it's not that they own wildlife. There's other resources that they own. But this specific one in terms of wildlife, which is the biggest generator in terms of income, that one they have conditional rights. But I think the most important thing is that for me, in my experience, has been having a government that actually supports their own policies and working with multiple stakeholders, including private sector, in making it work. And I think that's why this model has worked. It has its own challenges. I'm not going to shy away from it. It has not been very perfect, but I think in most cases it has been one of the successful ones that continuously we had looked over probably a period of around 27, 28 years. The other one is the issue of benefits, and I want to put an emphasis on this one because I've worked for more than 26 years around this, and I keep on asking myself, why are they getting involved? They are getting involved because they are consulted, they have inputs in terms of these policies, but secondly, they are deriving benefits. In my country, it's 100%, whether it's hunting, whether it's ecotourism, they own it, they manage it, and that's why they put in 100%, because they own it. So I think that is the difference that I see in other parts of the world, where even if it's conditional rights, they get probably half of a little, or they just don't get everything. But where they have a full legal right and policies to support them, but they also have the machinery behind it to do it, that has actually worked. So it's part of those issues. We have other challenges. Land rights is part of them. Some issues around human rights. These are some of the issues that we still need to address. But I think we have started at least contributing towards that 30%, and that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thanks. We'll take one more. If anybody has a comment or a question, we'll take one more, and then we have to end the session. So, going once, twice, 3 times. Okay, gone, none. Okay, so I think we have to close the session. So first, we would like to thank our 3 panelists. Thank you very much for participating and for sharing these, your perspectives and your views. We really appreciate that. Thank you. And then, of course, thanks to all of you for coming and participating in this side event. So thank you very much, and have a good evening.